Jake, thanks so much for being willing to answer a few questions related to your presentation at the symposium in Santa Fe. Um, I wanted to start just by asking you how you became interested in studying pornography, the philosophy of pornography.
Well, it started as an extension of my interest in philosophy of law. So I worked on issues in constitutional interpretation, what do statutes mean, and a lot of my work focused on the Eighth Amendment and interpreting cruel and unusual and the vagueness of those terms. And in dealing with vagueness in legal terms, I came across obscenity law, obviously, and how vague obscenity is and what obscenity statutes are. And so I was working on free speech and obscenity law, and I was invited by my honors college to teach a course. And they said, "Do you want to teach a course for us? Any topic you want?" And I said, "Sure, I'm working on free speech and obscenity right now." And they said, "Well, that's a bit narrow for a whole course. Could you broaden it out?" I was like, "Well, I could, but I don't know if you'd want me to go where it's going to naturally go, which is pornography." Right. And they were open to that. And they said, "Go ahead and let's build a class and see what it would look like." So I just naturally moved from looking at just speech and obscenity law to a lot of the literature that was written on pornography beyond speech. Pornography is discriminatory. Pornography is, objectifying, denigrating women, is misogynistic, and so on. And it was just a natural extension of the work I was doing on obscenity law. And once I kind of started delving into that literature more, I was just really fascinated. I was fascinated by the topic, but I was also fascinated by the kind of polarization of the dialogue.
Yeah.
That people were either completely and utterly supportive of pornography and said it's free speech, we don't even talk about it, it's protected, or the way people just condemned it entirely out of hand, that it's misogynistic, it's violent, and so on. And I thought there's got to be a reasoned middle ground here somewhere. I mean, every other media studies area has it, right? You can look at something and find value in it or contextualize it and so on. So that's where I really got interested in progressing it in looking at pornography as a phenomenon itself beyond just obscenity law and so on.
Okay. Well, I have sort of two lines of thought then. One is, tell me a little bit about how the philosophy of pornography, a book that you co-edited, I think, with Lindsay Coleman in 2014.
Yes.
What's the origin story there? How did that come into being?
So that's interesting. That actually fell into my lap. It was at the time Lindsay was putting the book together through an imprint of Rowman and Littlefield Press. I believe it was, I can't remember the name of the imprint now, but it's an offshoot. It's an imprint of Rowman. And I had been doing some editorial work for Rowman on areas in pop culture and philosophy, areas I work in. And apparently Lindsay had hit a stumbling block. He wasn't able to recruit the people he wanted to get in the book, and it just wasn't coming together. So my editor, my acquisitions editor at Rowman that I had worked with, contacted me knowing my area of research was pornography and said, "Do you want to give Lindsay a hand?" They'd apparently asked him if he'd be willing to have a co-editor, and his response from what they told me was, "Yes, but I'd only like to work with Jacob Held. If you can get Held to do it, I'll do it." And I was like, "Well, that's flattering." I had no idea that anybody knew who I was. And so I agreed to it. And when I looked at what he had up to that point, I was really impressed with the project. He had lined up about 6 or 7 authors.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was really trying to do was get the topography of the debate, get the topography of the issue. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't promoting an agenda. It wasn't, here's 20 chapters that are going to condemn pornography, or here's 20 chapters that are going to laud it. It was, here's the best research around on how to conceptualize this, from film theory to gender studies to political philosophy. And so I was really excited about getting involved. And then me and Lindsay started collaborating on it. And I was pleased to have him involved because he brought a different perspective.
Yeah.
So.
Jay, could you talk a little bit about your contribution to that particular volume?
Okay, so I have my one, what I would consider my standard philosophy chapter, which kind of rehashes some stuff I'd written, articles and so on pornography is speech, and is it protected as speech, and so on. What I was primarily arguing in that piece in the volume was that if we really look at what pornography is as a phenomenon, as media, right, then I think that a lot of the anti-porn arguments that want to decry it as somehow uniquely misogynistic or uniquely harmful kind of fail to appreciate that other aspects of media do the same thing, right? That other aspects of media present women in less than flattering roles, and it also fails to appreciate the diversity of pornography out there. That there is pornography that promotes positive images of women, that promotes positive body images, and so on. And so my basic conclusion is, like any other form of media or any other form of dialogue, the best response is education and more speech. So what we really need to do is have a broader discourse over pornography than just the kind of pro versus con debate, which doesn't seem to really be fruitful or help anybody go anywhere. But then I also have a piece in there that was an interview that I was able to do with Nina Hartley, which was really kind of exciting. So I'd actually reached out to Candida Royale. I'd reached out to her. I wanted to get her take, because she does produce more what would be considered women-friendly pornography films. And I thought, well, that'd be an interesting perspective to get. And so I just basically located her through her website and emailed her, and she responded, and she was real gracious. And we had a few conversations, and she said, you're probably better off talking to Nina Hartley.
Okay.
I was like, really? Okay. Okay. And so she gave me Nina Hartley's personal email address and said, I'll tell her that you're going to contact her. And so it was really interesting. I tried to structure it kind of like a Socratic Platonic dialogue, where it was supposed to leave the reader at the end in that kind of aporia, that kind of state of, I don't know what I think about this, but I've tread through the ideas a lot now.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really what I tried to do. And so what I did is had phone conversations with Nina Hartley and emailed back and forth, and basically wrote a bunch of like interview questions and then asked her to respond. And then she responded, and then I started trying to parse those, like piece those together into a dialogue format, and then we go back and forth editing it until we were both happy with it. And so that's how that happened. That's one of the things that I'm both academically pleased with how that turned out, but there's also a certain sense where I can go, yeah, and I co-authored something with Nina Hartley.
Right.
So there's that kind of vanity there. It's kind of, that's kind of.
So you mentioned this a couple times, and I guess I just wonder what your thoughts are about why it's so hard, why it's so difficult to have kind of open, meaningful dialogue about pornography. Why do you think we struggle to do that?
If I had to psychoanalyze the entire culture, I think it's just our attitude towards sex is very puritanical. I mean, if you think about when Janet Jackson had the whole nipple thing with the NFL game and the outrage, but at that same time on TV, you could see advertisements for Saw or Hostel or these kind of torture porn horror movies. And nobody was outraged that 10-year-old kids might be seeing that. Nobody was outraged that we might be desensitizing children to violence, but heaven forbid they see a nipple, right? Heaven forbid they see this. And so that's one of the things that I've always found particularly interesting about the debate is when I tell somebody that I work in pornography, there's immediate jokes and like, oh, you must love your research and ha ha ha. Right. And people think somehow there's got to be some sort of insidious motive to it, right? But somebody that studies horror films or somebody that studies the Holocaust, nobody goes, wow, what a weirdo. Yeah. He's fascinated over the death of 6 million Jews, right? You go, no, that's an important historical event. You should have people looking at that. Well, pornography is a significant cultural force. We should be thinking about it in terms of what it tells us about sexuality, how it reflects our sexuality, how we reflect it back. But because it's sex, I think we get oversensitive to it or overreact to it somehow. That it's got to be dirty, it's got to be insidious, it's got to be right. We don't talk about that. in polite company. And it's like, well, I think, sex is probably a pretty foundational experience for humans. And I think it's better to talk about it than not.
Than not, yeah.
So yeah, that was actually the interesting thing when I taught the course in my honors college on pornography, is they wanted to vet all the books I picked. Like, I had to pick textbooks, and then they had to vet them, and they wanted to go through my syllabus and vet it. And all the students, I mean, these are adults, right, in college, and they had to sign waivers.
Wow.
And the interesting thing was, like, a year before, a friend of mine in the English department had taught a course on horror films, where they were watching, like, just classic 1970s and 80s splatter films, right? I mean, there wasn't a single issue with that whatsoever. But as soon as I said, well, we're going to deal with pornography, it was, well, we better look at your textbooks. You have to get waivers signed. And it's like, these are adults who you're fully happy to expose to the most grotesque pictorial representations of violence without any second thought. But as soon as I want to bring in the context of sex, as soon as I want to talk about media that we know they're familiar with, we know they're looking at statistically, I have to get waivers signed. It was just that alone, that phenomenon to me was eye-opening.
Yeah.
This is amazing how quickly people really kind of want to lock up the discourse and want to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Jake, I guess I've got two more questions. One is, I've been really taken with Patricia Hill Collins' work around intellectual activism. Thinking about academics who are sort of speaking to the people and kind of helping us think more critically about what's happening socially. And I guess I wonder if that's an idea that is resonant for you. Is there activism in your academic work?
I don't know if I would consider it activism. I see my academic work, like my publishing, as an extension of my teaching.
Okay.
So I publish a lot in pop culture, and I publish in pornography. I publish on things that I find particularly relevant or interesting. I've never, as a philosopher, been interested in those ideas that only other philosophers know about. Right, I haven't been interested in that kind of esoteric dialogue. I know it exists and I value it, but I don't want to be there. I enjoy talking about topics that I think resonate with normal people, that I think are relevant to any human being who wants to kind of live a praiseworthy life or a reflective life. And so I don't know that I call it activism as much as I'm I'm very much oriented towards things that I find relevant.
Okay.
Right? That I see it as an extension of my teaching, and my teaching is always I see it as a way of kind of bringing philosophical wisdom that most people aren't going to cull the journals to get, right? Mm-hmm. Most people aren't going to read the text to get, but bringing that to students or a general audience in a way that helps them see its relevance to being self-reflective and critical thinkers.
Yeah. Well, so, Jake, what are you working on now? What are you interested in now? What are you writing now? What are you teaching now?
Well, teaching, I'm going to be teaching medieval philosophy in fall, which has absolutely nothing to do with anything we're talking about at all. But it's just an aberrant historical period that I'm interested in, and part of that's that I went to a Catholic, a Jesuit university,